This is going to be a pretty a lot of information is packed into these slides, so we're gonna zip through some of them. So you'll have to stay on your toes. For those of you who aren't familiar with theming in XJS at all, we'll briefly just touch on what you might do to get started. So first of all, you might have to choose between putting your styling in an app or a theme. And the difference is in a theme, or both can contain styling, but in a theme package, you will put styling that's shared between applications, and in your application, it will contain styling for its own views. So to get started, we want to generate an application. Most of you already have an application that uses command to build. If you don't, you need to generate one. So we type sencha generate app, and we pass the Toolkit switch there to generate a modern app. If you leave that out, it'll be a universal app. And then we put the name of our app and the directory where we want it to go. And that gives us a directory structure, something like this. And the first place you want to visit here is the var all.scss file. That's a great place to get started and just start setting the variables that the theme provides for you. And these are things like base color, most obviously, or variables that pertain to individual components. You can break these up further. We'll go into that later. But this is the best place to get started. You can find all the variables in the theme documentation. If you just pull up the class docs, scroll down to the very bottom, there's a section with all the theme variables listed. The second place you want to look at in your app structure that you just generated is the SAS source directory. And all the rule generating code goes there, mixin calls, and CSS rules for styling for your application's views. These also are, SCSS files are auto-included based on the class path of classes in your application. So if we have a class called, if our app is called theme demo and we have a theme demo.view.main class, that'll automatically include a main.css at the same path in our SAS directory. You want to use fashion to compile your code, so make sure you're using the -- fashion switch, which allows you to see live updates in your browser without page refreshes. I'll show that to you in a demo shortly. When you do that, you see something like this. It gives you starts a server for you at port 1841, and you can load that up in your browser and off you go. Just start changing variables in that var all file, and you'll see live updates on your screen. To share styling between applications, you need a theme package, which you can do by going into your application directory and running a sencha generate package of type theme. You tell it what theme you'd like to extend, and then you name it. It's as simple as that. That drops a theme package into your packages directory of your application, which you can then copy elsewhere, share it around, put it in source control if you want. If we pop that theme directory open, we'll see a structure similar to what we have in the app. There's a SAS folder with source and var directories, and these are also included based on the class path of actual JavaScript classes, but here we're talking about framework classes, not application views. So things like text field would pull in SCSS files at those same paths in the source and var directory. So you can use this technique to organize your code. Which theme do you want to extend? Well, I recommend the Triton theme. You can see the structure is a bit simpler on the modern side because we don't have the classic hierarchy of themes. Classic and gray are gone. And nor do we have the touch sizing themes. That's built into the theme, so we'll touch on that later. So I would start with Triton. That's the best place to start to build a custom theme, but you could also, if you prefer to start with Material or Neptune or iOS, you could do that as well. So let's talk about variables. First thing we want to remember is all theme variables must be dynamic. Usually you don't have to worry about this if you're just changing the theme's variables, but for any newly declared variables, you must use the dynamic function. When overriding the framework variables, it's not required, but you should still use it. Just get in the habit of using it. It's always safe. What does it do? Well, it means the last assignment wins and is valid throughout the entire scope. If we assign a value to base color, then we use it in a rule, and then we assign a different value. The last value is the value that's used in the rule. And this just helps us organize our code better. It simplifies things because it means that we don't have to worry about the ordering of when we can use variables versus when we can derive from them, and so on. In Modern, we have put forward some conventions that we're going to use to simplify the naming process for variables, because there's thousands of them. It can be overwhelming, and highly recommend you use Themer to find out what you need to, what variables you need. But if you're not using Themer, this will help you determine what the variables might be named. So they begin with X type, end with a CSS property name like button font size, tab background color, or list item border width. The element name, if there's an element inside the component, a reference element, that would come after the X type but before the CSS property name. So buttons have a badge. We call that button badge color, or text field input padding, or list item disclosure margin. State variables describe the state of the component, like hovered or pressed. The state comes after the thing it describes, whether that be the X type itself or the element. So button pressed color or list item selected. Border color would be examples of that. List item has a disclosure element inside of it. When that's pressed, we put the pressed state after the disclosure. And these are our states: pressed, hovered, selected, focused, and disabled. We try to standardize these throughout the framework. So this is an improvement in Modern. In Classic, the naming was not quite as consistent, so this should help make things a little bit easier for you guys. One of the main requirements for theming is that styling needs to be inherited through the class hierarchy. Components should inherit styles defined by their superclass. This is not always as straightforward as it seems because of the way things may be architected. But in the Modern Toolkit, we've made sure that this happens naturally via the CSS cascade. And the way we do that is a special property that you can set on the class body called the class CLS. And if you're familiar with base class, it works the same way, but it's inherited through the class hierarchy. So what that means is if we define a class, extend component, then we extend that class, create an instance of the child, the DOM, main element for that component, would look something like this. It's got the class CLS of the parent and of the child and of component, because component has X component as its class CLS. So class CLS root is a way you can opt out of this inheritance if you need to. This is more of an edge case. In most cases, you always want to inherit the styling, but if we set class CLS root to true, we can say, no, please don't give me the class CLSs from my parent and its parent and so on. So this approach allows us to naturally inherit styling throughout the DOM hierarchy using the CSS cascade without playing any special tricks. Let's talk about component UIs. So what are they? It's a way to have multiple presentations or appearances for a single component. So in the Triton theme, our default button looks something like this. And you can also have many other kinds of buttons. These are just different appearances of the button. They're not subclasses of button. They're just different ways we can present that same button class. So we could have an action, a confirm, decline, even a round. To use these UIs, we use the UI config of the component. We'd set it to action. And that gives us a nice pretty blue button with the X button action class on it that gives it its blue styling. Notice it also has the X button class on it, which is the class CLS of button. That gives it its base styling. That gives you all the styling necessary to create that gray button. So the action UI simply adds blueness to it. if we were to create an instance of this in our previous example, if we were to take that child component, create an instance of it and set its UI to foo, well, that UI name gets appended to each class CLS in the hierarchy. So it gets X parent foo, X child foo, and X component foo. So every level of the hierarchy, the class in question gets an opportunity to add its own styling and or override some styling inherited from its superclass. And this all happens, once again, via the CSS cascade. You can use one or many UIs. It's really up to you. The way we use multiple ones is we just add them in a space-separated string. So in this case, we could say action round is our UI. And that gives us a button with both action and round UI classes on it. These important things to note about composable UIs is that they should ideally deal with different aspects of styling. So if you had two UIs that changed the color, you wouldn't want to compose those, because the last one in the style sheet would always win. So in this case, we have roundness and we have blueness, and we can combine those to create a blue round button. And so you could combine as many as you need, just put them all in this space-separated list. Let's look at the structure of a UI mixin real quick. This is what it looks like in the framework. So the mixin names are always follow the X type of the thing being styled. So our X type is button. Our mixin is called button UI. The first parameter is always the UI name. And then we have all the parameters that set the CSS properties of that component or its various parts or states. This is an interesting line. Basically, we just take the UI name and we create a suffix that goes at the end of our class CLS, like we saw earlier. And if no UI is passed, you get no suffix. So if you call this mixin with no UI name, our selector would be X button. And that's how we create the default styling for a button, is the framework will call it. And then finally, we output some rules here. You could also have additional selectors inside here which style child elements and or different various states of the component. The thing that makes this all really work nicely is the magic of how null values work. So if we define two colors or two variables, one of them is null and one of them has a value, and we use them both in a rule, what's the output? Well, only the variable that had an assigned value is included in the output. If neither one of these variables had a value, if they were both null, that entire rule would be eliminated. So it's a great space optimization for your CSS files. And we take advantage of that heavily in the modern toolkit to make sure your file size is very minimal. So that one was completely eliminated because it was null. So the mixins leverage this. If you call the button UI mixin and pass no parameters, no colors and paddings and things like that, you're going to get nothing in your output. If you pass maybe a single color, you'll get only the minimal set of styling needed to change just that thing. You won't get all the rest of the parts of the button styling that might be required to make a button look like a button. So internally in the framework, we leverage this to create the styling for the default UI. So remember how I showed you the gray button. The way we generate that in the framework is we have all these global variables that you can see in the docs, and then we invoke the button UI mixin, passing each and every one of those along as the values for this invocation. So this invocation sets all the variables, and important thing to note is there's no UI parameter passed here. So that means the selector that we're going to get is just X button. And then we might also style like a pressed state or hover states. We might style child elements of the button targeted using the X button class, which every button has regardless of its UI. And so that creates its base styling. Then we layer on top of that all the UIs, which may set only a small subset of those styles, but these selectors contain the UI name in them, and that's how they can be composed and combined and layered on top of one another without potentially colliding. It's a great way to also to save space and make sure your CSS file size remains really tiny so that it downloads quickly. So let's get to the good stuff. Many of you probably laid awake at night asking this question. And in the classic toolkit, the answer was probably not. The reason is the way Classic is architected, it views the grid as one big monolithic component. It does have some other components included in it, like column headers and so on, but all the rows and cells are all just part of the grid. So let's take a look at the anatomy of a modern grid. Well, we've got a text cell, a date cell, a number cell, row number cell, check cell, expander cell, widget cell, which contains a sparkline widget inside of it, a row, a column header, check column header, a group header row, and a paging toolbar. This is only a subset of the things you can have in a grid. The nice part about the modern grid, though, is that each and every one of these items I called out here is a component. So therefore, being a component, they can have their own UIs. First thing to remember, though, is that grids being lists, in order to style the grid, we need to understand how the list works. So the list has a config called item config, which configures the items. That's the default config that's applied to all the items in the list. And we can use that to add a UI. Say we have a list of contacts. Let's add a UI of contacts to the list. Then let's invoke the list item UI mixin, passing along the UI of contact, and we'll change a few colors. The resulting output gives us some CSS that produces something like this. We changed a few variables. We got a very minimal addition to our CSS file, maybe only a couple extra rules, and we changed the list from looking light themed to dark themed. So how does that relate to a grid? Well, in a grid, the rows are the list items. And so we can use the same item config to configure the UI of grid rows. So let's do the same thing, add the UI of contact to our contact list, or contact grid. And instead of invoking the list item UI mixin to generate styling for it, we invoke grid row UI. How about the group header? Well, that's actually an aspect of the row. So once again, we can use the item config to configure the row, and we can use the row's header config to configure the UI of the group row. Invoking the row header UI mixin, passing along our UI name once again. How about column headers? Well, I'm sure you all know grids have a columns array, which contains a list of config objects for columns. So we can set the UI for our columns right on there. And we can invoke the grid column UI, which happens to be the X type of those columns, passing along the UI name and changing its properties. How about cells? Well, grid cells have a UI too, and we can access those via the column config. All columns have a cell config on which you can configure a default config for all the cells in that column. So pass the UI along again, invoke the grid cell UI mixin to generate some styling for it, and you're all set. Finally, let's look at the paging toolbar. It, being a plugin that manages a component, also has a way to configure that component. So on the paging toolbar plugin, we have a toolbar config, which we can use to configure the UI of the toolbar. So this may seem like a lot to configure the grid, But the key thing to take away here is that it really allows you to configure the parts of the grid individually, and thus making it possible to have many presentations for the same component. Once again, you can look. We'll take questions at the end if you can hold it. So the docs are the best place to look to find out what the UI mixins are. You can pretty much guess what they are because they're X-type-UI. But we can see here that check cell has a check cell UI mixin, and it also lists the grid cell UI mixin because, once again, a check cell is a grid cell, and so it inherits styling from that mixin as well. And then it adds its own, via its own mixin, it adds styling for its checkbox. We pop one of these open, we can see the parameters that it supports. The important takeaway here is to remember that in the modern toolkit, compound components are the sum of their parts. So pattern is repeated throughout the framework. Other examples of this are the slider and the thumb. The thumb can have its own UI, which is separate from the slider. The trigger has its own UI, which might be separate from text field. And exceptions to this currently are the panel header and panel tools, which are all part of the panel UI. This is slated for improvement to match the approach we've taken in the rest of the framework in the future. So earlier I mentioned how the modern toolkit doesn't have any of these touch-sized themes, which are just larger sizing and spacing to be friendly on touch screens so that you can tap things. And the modern toolkit's answer to that is a single theme that handles both modes. This is advantageous because you don't have to have multiple builds to adding to your app build time. So all it is larger sizing and spacing for touchscreens. Whereas we use separate themes in Classic, we can do it in a single theme in Modern via this class that we put on the HTML element. And that's the only thing that toggles it. So in fact, in dev mode, I have a bookmarklet that toggles that class on the HTML element as I'm developing, so I can see the styling in big and normal modes. So how does the theme choose between big and normal modes, and how can you customize that? Well, there's a function that allows you to do that, and we put that function in our theme overrides directory in an init.js file. And this function is called ext.theme.getDocCLS. And whoopsies. And it simply returns the xbig class under certain conditions. In this case, on desktop, it's normal, and on phones and tablets, it's big. You can opt out of big mode by simply setting enable big to false at the SAS level, which will disable the generation of all the big mode rules in your style sheet. So if you want a really small style sheet and you don't need to support big mode, you can turn them off entirely. In the framework, we've implemented big mode rules in a very simple way. In the case of the button UI mixin, we set the padding on the button element, and then we say if big mode is enabled, we output an additional rule with the xbig selector above it. And you'll notice in the modern toolkit that all of the variables that affect sizing and spacing of components contain big counterparts. And so this is how we do it, and that results in multiple rules. Once again, that second rule there would be completely eliminated from your output if you had not enabled big mode in your build. So the thing we like to encourage you to do is to use the SAS API whenever possible, the variables and mixins, to style your applications. And we'd like it if you could stick to that, but we understand that sometimes your organization may have requirements that our theming API cannot meet. And so what I'd like to just share with you briefly is some rules for breaking the rules. So first of all, I'd like you to let us know on the forums if you have a need that our theming API does not meet, because we really like to improve the theming API and make it meet your needs. And then the second thing you do is use the same techniques that we as the framework authors use to style the framework components. So we've already mentioned class CLS. Let's talk briefly about the conventions we use for our DOM structure and markup. So class CLS always matches the X type and goes on the main element. For example, class with an X type of grid column has a class CLS of X grid column. And this pattern is we follow throughout the framework. If we configure that with a UI, once again, we've got the class CLS and the UI class CLS on the main element. The other thing that goes on the main element are state and configuration classes. So these would be things like align left and sorted. If the column has a sorted state, that would go here. Notice these don't contain any information that identifies the X type or the UI of the thing we're styling. And so that means that these have to be chained to the class CLS to style the component. So for example, we might say xGridColumn dot X sorted with no space in between. Or xGridColumn with the UI on it dot X align left. The selectors you don't want to use are like this, X sorted, which would match every component that has a sorted state. Or X align left space and then the name of a reference element. That would match everything that has an align left config with a reference element named title. So we don't want to use those because those will be too greedy. Reference elements are always named. The class names always match the name of the reference element. So the example is column with a title element receives a class name of X title L. And to select these in our style sheet, we always want to use descendant selectors instead of direct child selectors. So for example, we would say grid column with a space in between and then the reference element. We would not use this form, which selects the reference element as a direct child, even if it is a direct child. And the reason for that is because we, as the framework authors, from time to time, have to change the markup in subtle ways to work around issues or to add features. And we don't want to break your rules. So don't use this form. If you're concerned about performance and you've heard that the one on the right is more performant, it's not. Modern browsers are so heavily optimized that there's really no perceivable difference between these two. The exception to this rule is when container nesting is possible. So we can't use descendant selector on the panel's inner element because it would select the panel's inner element and the inner elements of all the panels within it and all the panels within them. So instead, we have to include the UI and the X type information in that element's class name. So in this example, X panel inner foo. So do not use a descendant selector to select something that is nestable. When in doubt, look at the rules that are used by the framework. Look at those selectors in your dev tools and just copy the ones we use. That's usually the safest bet. And we're going to try our best to try to keep those consistent across releases with minimal breakage. Once again, we can't guarantee that the DOM will never change, but we can sure try to make these selectors not break across releases. So hopefully you can accomplish what you need using the SAS API, but when you have to break the rules, this is how to break them. We're really happy to announce that we've got the new material and iOS themes available for you in 6.2. Hopefully some of you have already tried these out, but let's take a look at them real quick and see what they do. This is what they look like. We've modeled them after native iOS and Android look and feel. The iOS theme is based on Triton. It extends the Triton theme. It follows the latest iOS look and feel. So we basically just looked at iOS, the latest version of it, and emulated everything that it does as closely as we possibly could. The iOS theme will evolve with iOS going forward, so as they change and update their look, we'll try to match that. We'll try to, evolve with them. And it's customizable. All the framework theme variables and mixins are available, just like they are in the other themes. Nothing is hard-coded, so you can use the iOS theme as a base theme if you think it makes a suitable starting point for your custom theme. The material theme is based on Neptune. It follows the material design guidelines laid out by Google. It uses a material color palette and, most excitingly, supports CSS variables, which we'll demo for you in just a moment. So this is what the material color palette looks like, or a part of it. There's a lot of named colors that Google has picked for us, and then they have, each one of them has 10 different shades. If you were in the keynote this morning, you probably noticed these in the Themer app. So once again, a great reason to use Themer. All this stuff is baked into it. But if you're manually theming, this might seem a little overwhelming. And fortunately, we've taken all that out of the equation by handling all that for you. So where material design guidelines recommend using different shades of different colors, we've followed that guideline as closely as we can in the framework to make all those things work out. So the only thing that you really have to remember is to use the named colors. And Google has them at this URL up here, material.google.com/style/color.html. They're all listed there. And these are the names that you're going to use when you're customizing the material theme for your applications. So if we want to configure the material theme, we don't use the base color variable. This is the only theme where I don't want you to set the base color. What you use instead is the base color name. And that's where you pass in Google's one of Google's preset names, and then the material theme will go in for you, and it'll figure out all the different shades of indigo in this case that are appropriate for various things like selected rows, toolbars, grid row headers. All may use different shades of indigo as their background color. The other thing you want to set is the accent color, and this is used in various cases. It defaults to orange. It's just a highlight color that draws attention to particular things in the framework. And finally, there's a dark mode variable that you might want to set, which will toggle your app between light mode and dark mode. Really, these are the only three variables that you really want to concern yourself with in the material theme. Anything outside of this is sort of not outside the scope of material design. So like I mentioned, all of the derived colors, all the spacing and sizing, we figured out for you based on the material guidelines. And of course, it's possible to use any of the variables available in the themes or any of the mixins in a material theme. But you're on your own. If you want to call it material, then you've got to make sure that you're following the material guidelines. So since we have these great new themes, you might also have some custom themes of your own. A likely thing that you'll want to do is to change what theme you display to your users based on what kind of device they're using. So to do that, we go into our app.json file, and we can, using the builds property, we can configure a few different builds, each one using a different theme. And the second thing you want to do, and don't worry about the content of all this, you need to just make sure you have the correct output directories in your app.json. And what I've pasted here onto the slide is exactly what you get when you generate a universal app. So Sencha generate app, and do not pass the modern switch like you saw in the earlier slide, and your app.json will contain this property. And this just ensures that the output of your builds goes into the correct directories. And then the third thing that we need to do is in our index file for our application, we will add a before load function. Now, this is a special function that is called by the framework to determine which profile to load. And the important part of this function is at the very end. ext.manifest equals the profile name of the profile that you want to load. And what I've done in this function is used the handy tags parameter to this function, which contains some information about the platform, to make a choice as far as what theme we want to load. So let's take a look at how some of this looks in the browser. Okay. So I happen to already have app watch running, and can you see that? Notice I've used the fashion switch when running app watch. Excuse me. And once again, I highly recommend that you use this when doing development, because it's going to make your lives a lot easier if you aren't using it. How many of you guys are running fashion in browser when you do development? Okay, so a few of you. So this is a really handy feature that you really want to be using. So if I go into my code here, and okay, so let me refresh this. Okay, so if I look in my browser console, you can see that doesn't look like it's running fashion. That's unusual. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, looks like it picked a different port on me because it thought that one was already in use, so we'll just use that one. That's fine. I don't think that was the right browser console window. Hey, there it is. Let's try this again. Now look at my browser console window, and you can see these log statements here, and you can actually watch it building your CSS real time. So it is running fashion in the browser and compiling the CSS for us. So now that it's done its initial build, I can go into my source code, and I could set base color name to indigo. And when I save that, you notice it only took a couple seconds to change the entire theme. So what happened there is Fashion is monitoring the file system for us. And when it detects a change, it sends a message to the browser that tells it to recompile everything. And this all happens almost instantaneously before I could Alt-Tab back to the browser. So if you aren't using this feature when you're theming, highly recommend it. It'll save you a lot of time. So if you're using the material theme, one of the things you might be interested in is the CSS variable feature. And what that allows you to do is to change your colors of your theme at runtime. And you could do this even in production. This is not only a dev mode feature. So you can see here that we've got a bunch of colors specified here on this root selector. And these, the double hyphen at the beginning indicates that it's a CSS variable that we're setting. And these variables are referenced throughout many CSS rules in the framework to set various colors of things. So if we wanted to, this is not the recommended way of doing it, but if we wanted to, we could go in here and just change one of these variables directly and see what happens. Okay, so everything that was using base color directly just updated. However, we notice that some of these things are still purple. That's because they were using derivations of base color based on invoking a SAS function which lightened or darkened or mixed the color with some other color. So if we want it all to cascade down and update all of the variables, we have to use fashion. And so since we're running fashion here in dev mode, we have this handy fashion function, fashion.css.set variables, and we can pass base color name here, and we can set it to, what do we want, green? So now you can see we've got the material green, we've got the right shade of green that Google wants us to use, and also our grid header and selection color and all the colors that are derived from the green were properly updated. The exciting part about this is that when you are using the material theme, since it supports CSS variables, when you run a build, this function that I just called will actually be available to you in production. So you could use this to create some sort of a UI to give your users control over which colors they want to use. And all you'd have to do is invoke this function to change the CSS variables and update their colors. So we could also set the this is an object here, so we can add as many properties as we want. Accent, color, name, to say red. And that accent color is used in various places. One of them would be the date picker selection. So you can see that October 16th is colored red here. And then finally, the other thing that your users are going to want to change is dark mode. A lot of us prefer light on dark background. We always have to use strings here, so it's the string true, not Boolean. And that flipped our entire theme into dark mode. So this is very powerful. You can use this to give your users a little bit more power over their colors that they want to use. Let's see. So we have a few minutes left. So let's take a look at the theme switching capabilities that I mentioned earlier. So I've got a starter app, which I generated, and can you see that? Maybe? Okay. So then when I built this app, you can see, let me show you the app JSON real quick. So because in my app JSON, I have these three builds configured, these three build profiles. Anytime I run Sencha app build, it's going to build all of these profiles. And so, and look at the log here, you can see first it processes the material build descriptor, then later on it hits Triton, and it built iOS in the middle there somewhere. And so all of the assets and things for these builds went into appropriate directories so that now I can load a different build depending on the device that the user is loading the app on. So in our index.html file, you can see the before load function that we just saw earlier in the slides. And we're setting the manifest, once again, to the profile that we want to load. So if I want to test that in my browser, I can do that in Chrome simply by loading the app up here. And we can see that on a desktop device, we got the Triton theme. If we want to emulate a mobile device, like let's say the Nexus, and refresh the page, all of a sudden we're in the material theme. Or we could use an iPhone, and it loads the iOS theme. So using this technique, we can give our users the right experience that's custom for their device, and using CSS variables, we can further allow them to customize the look and feel the way they want it. So I hope you guys will go and try this out. Give us your feedback. And I appreciate you coming to my session. I hope you enjoyed it and learned a lot. And please take the survey in the mobile app when you get a chance. Just navigate to this session in the Shensicon app, click on Evaluate Session, and then you will be entered to win one of 5 $50 Amazon gift cards. So thanks again. And if you have any feedback after trying all this out, please let us know in the forums. Please let us know what features are missing that you really need, because we really want to improve this further going forward and provide you guys with the best possible development experience. So I'll go ahead and take your questions now if you guys have any. Yes?
Is there merit to including the fashion compiler in production mode? Sounds like
it's not the entire fashion compiler. I'm sorry I didn't mention that. So it's just a small function that accepts an input with variable names, and then it goes and applies those to the CSS variables on the root object. So it's a very minimal amount. It's not the entire fashion compiler. So the way it works is, you look skeptical. So the reason it works is because when you build, it goes through and detects all the places where you're deriving colors from other colors and setting those to other variables, and it builds that logic into this small function that it gives you. And so then when you set base color, it goes and determines that, the grid selection color was base color lightened by 40%. And it sets that CSS variable accordingly. So, yes, sir?
Sure. So how much of that is integrated into Architect 4? Like, for example, the grid UIs or the grid, all these different elements of the grid that you could style.
Mm-hmm.
How much of it is visible to Architect?
I believe you should be able to do all of it, because in Architect, let me take that back. We're going to need to ask the architect folks. But since all those things are just configuration options of those components, if you can drill into the component and view it in Architect and configure it, then you should be able to do to configure its UI. So I believe it should be possible, but we would need to check. Yes, sir. Class CLS is implemented on ext.widget, which is in the core package. So if you're using a widget, Class CLS is available in the classic toolkit. But as far as all the componentry, no, it's not. So pretty much everything I described today is the modern approach to theming. Yes? Yeah, I'm not sure about that. We'd have to ask Mark Mercado would be the one to ask about that. I'm sorry?
you can enable it in the plugin.
You can? Okay.
You can change the command that until J is running.
Or you just need to put it in the app JSON.
Yeah.
There's a config that you can put
Okay.
in the app JSON that will work fashion.
All right. There you go. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Can you run fashion inside your EXT.js?
Run fashion inside what?
EXT.js in production?
Well, you can run, that's interesting. That's uncharted territory, so I don't know how you would do something like that. The only thing that we officially support right now is the thing I showed you with the CSS variables. It's just a small subset of fashion, one little function.
Script, how did that come from the command?
Yeah, so at build time, it compiles that function for you into your build. Any others? All right, I think we're out of time. Oh, one more.
Perhaps it's more of a command question, but theming in a live application, we can't really use command for proxying because we have to run it on Apache or something like that.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to have to take your question outside. It sounds like a more involved question that doesn't have a quick answer. Thank you all for coming, and enjoy the rest of CentraCon.